The world gasped when the truth was finally revealed. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and people pointed in disbelief. A young woman who was once treated like a slave now stood tall in a glittering dress, her eyes filled with fire. Her enemies sat in the crowd, trembling, unable to believe that the girl they had mocked, beaten, and sold as a maid was now the one holding their fate. But before she spoke her final words, before her revenge was complete, her mind returned to the very night her pain began. Years earlier, she had been dragged out of her small village house in the dead of night. Her stepmother's eyes were cold, without mercy. Money had exchanged hands, and in return, the girl was sold like an object to a wealthy family in the city. She was promised food and shelter, but what she received was chains of humiliation. From the very first day, she realized she was not considered human in that mansion. She scrubbed floors until her knees bled, washed dishes until her fingers cracked, and slept on a cold cement floor like a stray dog. But deep inside, a fire was burning. Each insult, each slap, each cruel command planted a seed of revenge in her heart. She began to whisper to herself in the night, promising that one day they would regret ever underestimating her. She had no idea how, she had no money or power, but she believed that destiny would open a door. That belief was the only thing that kept her alive. What no one knew was that the same house where she was suffering would one day become the stage of her greatest victory. The mansion was a palace compared to her village home. Golden chandeliers sparkled on the ceilings, marble floors shone like glass, and servants moved quietly from corner to corner. But she was not treated like the other workers. They had uniforms, beds, and bricks. She had nothing. Her room was a dark store under the staircase, smelling of dust and rat droppings. At night, when the family laughed upstairs at their big dining table, she would sit in the darkness, her stomach crying from hunger. The master of the house, Mr. Roland, was a man who loved power. He never looked at her as a person. To him, she was just another tool to display his wealth. His wife, Madame Helen, was even worse. She enjoyed humiliating her, often spilling food on the floor and ordering her to lick it up. Sometimes Madame Helen would invite her rich friends and force her to serve them barefooted, calling her names as though she were an animal. Every insult dug deeper into her soul, making her wonder if she would ever escape. Yet, in those darkest moments, she noticed something no one else did. The house had secrets. Mr. Roland kept files locked in his office, and Madame Helen often whispered with strangers who brought envelopes of cash late at night. One evening, while cleaning the office, she found a torn piece of paper in the trash bin. On it were numbers and a name connected to foreign accounts. Her heart raced. She did not fully understand what it meant, but she knew it was dangerous, something worth keeping in her memory. That discovery gave her a new kind of strength. She realized that the same people who thought they owned her were hiding something that could destroy them. And in her heart, she swore that if destiny ever gave her the chance, she would use their secrets as her weapon. Rain poured heavily one night as she knelt in the kitchen, scrubbing the greasy tiles until her back ached. The sound of thunder outside mixed with the laughter of the family in the dining room. She was forbidden to eat with them, so she watched silently from the doorway as they dined on roasted chicken and rich wine. Her stomach twisted, but her face remained calm. She had learned to hide her emotions, for one wrong look could bring her a slap. But that same night, something happened that stayed in her memory forever. After clearing the dishes, she accidentally broke a plate. Madame Helen's fury exploded. Without a word, she ordered two guards to drag the girl to the backyard. They tied her to a wooden pole, and under the cold rain, she was whipped until her skin tore. The pain was unbearable, but she did not scream. She bit her lip and swallowed her cries, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her tears. Madame Helen called her weak, but in truth, her silence was strength. When the guards finally left her shivering in the rain, she whispered to herself, "One day, I will not just stand here. One day, you will kneel before me." It sounded impossible at the time, but she meant every word. Her wounds healed slowly, leaving scars that reminded her of her vow. From that day, something changed in her spirit. She stopped seeing herself as a victim. She started studying her surroundings carefully, watching how money moved in the house, memorizing the names of visitors, and noting every secret conversation she overheard. She was preparing without even knowing it, and her revenge was slowly being born in the shadows. The mansion's garden was a place of beauty for the family, but for her, it was a prison yard. She was forced to trim the flowers under the hot sun, water the plants, and pick out weeds with her bare hands. Often, Madame Helen would watch from the balcony, sipping juice, mocking her like she was watching a show. But one afternoon, while walking in the garden, she overheard a conversation that would stay in her mind for years. Mr. Roland was speaking to a stranger in a black suit, his voice low but sharp. She crouched behind the hedge, pretending to pull weeds while listening carefully. The man in the suit handed Mr. Roland a brown envelope, and though she could not see inside, the edge of a foreign bank slip peeked out. Mr. Roland chuckled and said, "As long as no one finds out, we are untouchable." The stranger nodded, replying, "But if this leaks, you lose everything." Her heart pounded. She realized the people who seemed so powerful were not as untouchable as they believed. They had weaknesses hidden behind their wealth. That knowledge gave her hope. She knew she had nothing now, but she began to believe that time would make her stronger. She just had to endure. That night, when everyone was asleep, she lay awake in her tiny room under the stairs, staring at the cracks on the ceiling. She replayed those words in her mind. "If this leaks, you lose everything." She didn't yet know how, but she felt certain that one day, those secrets would help her escape her chains. What she didn't know was that the same garden where she had crouched in fear would one day be the same place where her enemies would tremble at her feet. The days grew into months, and the girl's life became a routine of endless labor and hidden pain. Every morning before the sunrise, she was already awake sweeping the massive compound while the family slept. At night, she washed piles of dishes until her hands were raw. Yet, no matter how hard she worked, she was never praised. Instead, Madame Helen always found faults. If the floor was spotless, she complained about the dust on the window. If the meal was cooked well, she accused her of stealing a spoon of food. It was a cycle designed to break her spirit. But instead of breaking, she grew stronger. Her eyes became sharper, her memory keener, and her patience deeper. She stopped asking for kindness and started storing every humiliation inside her like hidden arrows. Sometimes, when she was locked in her tiny room, she would whisper to herself, "This is not forever. One day, I will write a story the whole world will read." She did not mean books. She meant her revenge, the kind of revenge that will be remembered in whispers for generations. One evening, as she was mopping the hallway, she caught a glimpse of herself in a large mirror. She barely recognized the girl staring back. Her hair was rough, her clothes torn, her eyes weary, but there was also something new, a quiet strength, a determination that refused to die. She touched the scars on her arm, reminders of the night she was whipped in the rain, and instead of crying, she smiled faintly. That moment became her secret turning point. She realized that the same mansion that was meant to crush her spirit was silently training her. Every insult was sharpening her. Every slap was preparing her. Every secret she uncovered was giving her a weapon. And though no one noticed it yet, a storm was silently gathering within her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Trouble began to brew in the mansion, though no one spoke of it openly. She noticed it first in the whispers between the other servants. Packages arrived at odd hours, visitors came through the back gate instead of the front, and Mr. Rowland spent long hours locked inside his office with a phone pressed to his ear. Whenever she passed by, she could hear fragments of his voice, talks about shipment, payment, and names that sounded foreign. One night, curiosity drove her to linger by the office door. Through the crack, she saw Mr. Rowland stuffing bundles of cash into a black briefcase. Sweat covered his forehead as if he feared being caught. Suddenly, he looked up and she jumped back, her heart racing. But he didn't open the door. He muttered something under his breath and continued packing. She ran quickly to her little room, shaking, yet strangely excited. She didn't understand the full picture, but she knew these secrets could one day be her escape. Meanwhile, Madame Helen grew crueler. Perhaps she sensed that the girl was no longer afraid. One morning, Helen forced her to kneel on raw rice for hours simply because the tea was too hot. The pain shot through her knees, but she endured it silently, eyes burning with hidden rage. Helen thought she had broken her again, but in truth, she had only sharpened her determination. That night, while pressing her knees gently to ease the pain, the girl whispered to herself, "You are blind, madam. You do not see that you are teaching me how to conquer you." She closed her eyes, imagining a day when she would walk out of that house not as a broken servant, but as a woman powerful enough to make the world bow. She had no idea that her time of rising was closer than she thought. The turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in Mr. Rowland's office, she noticed a folder half slid out of the drawer. Curiosity pushed her to peek inside. What she saw made her hands tremble. It was filled with documents, contracts signed under false names, records of smuggled goods, and proof of stolen funds. At the bottom of the folder lay a passport with a fake identity, but Mr. Rowland's picture. She quickly closed the folder before anyone entered, but her mind raced. This was no longer just about her suffering. This was something bigger, something that could ruin the entire family if exposed. For the first time, she felt she was holding a weapon, even though it was only in her memory. She didn't take the documents, but she burned every detail into her mind, word for word, number for number. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. The rats scurried in the dark corners of her small room, but her thoughts were louder. She imagined what would happen if the world saw those papers. The family that treated her like death would fall from their golden throne. A smile crept onto her lips. She realized she no longer had to dream of revenge. It was already within her grasp. The next morning, Madame Helen slapped her for serving juice late. But this time, instead of feeling weak, she felt strangely powerful. She looked Helen straight in the eye, and for the first time, she didn't lower her gaze. Madame Helen paused, shocked by the boldness, then hissed and walked away. That small act of defiance was dangerous, but it fed her spirit. In her heart, she whispered, "One day, these papers will be your downfall." Weeks passed, and the secret she carried inside her grew heavier. She walked silently, but her eyes were always sharp. Every conversation, every visitor, every envelope that changed hands added more pieces to the puzzle. The family had no idea that their quiet little maid was becoming the silent keeper of their destruction. One night, while scrubbing the floor in the living room, she overheard Mr. Rowland speaking furiously on the phone. His voice echoed through the hall. "If the government finds out, it's over for me," he shouted. He paced back and forth, gripping his forehead, unaware that she was crouched only a few feet away. She lowered her head, pretending to polish the tiles, but every word sank deep into her memory. When he finally slammed the phone down and stormed upstairs, she whispered to herself, "Yes, your end is near." But her revenge was not only about Mr. Rowland and Madame Helen. It was about every insult, every scar, every tear she had swallowed in silence. It was about the nights she slept on the cold floor, the mornings she starved, the days she bled from wounds no one cared about. She wanted more than escape. She wanted justice that would echo beyond the walls of this mansion. That determination grew even stronger when one of the other servants, a kind old woman named Grace, was fired without mercy. Grace had worked in the mansion for 15 years, yet Madame Helen threw her out one evening just because she broke a cup. Watching Grace weep as she was dragged out of the gate, the girl clenched her fists. It wasn't just her battle anymore. She swore that one day she would avenge not only herself, but also every soul crushed by this family's cruelty. The seasons changed, but her scars remained the same. She had grown from a frightened maid into a woman who carried secrets sharper than a blade. Yet she was careful, too careful. She never showed her strength openly because she knew that one wrong step could end her life. The Rowlands were powerful, and if they sensed she knew too much, they would bury her quietly without a trace. One evening, Madame Helen hosted a grand party. The mansion sparkled with lights, music echoed through the halls, and wealthy guests filled the rooms with laughter. She was ordered to serve drinks, moving silently among men in suits and women in glittering gowns. But as she served, her eyes caught something shocking. One of the guests, a foreign businessman, slipped Mr. Rowland a flash drive in a handshake. She watched closely, memorizing his face, his words, and the nervous way Rowland pocketed the device. She walked away quietly, but her heart pounded. She knew whatever was in that flash drive was dangerous. Later that night, she risked everything. While cleaning Rowland's office, she found the flash drive carelessly left on the table. She didn't have a computer, but she held it in her palm, imagining the power it contained. She quickly returned it before anyone noticed, but the seed was already planted in her mind. That night, lying in her dark room, she whispered, "Your empire is built on lies, and one day it will all come crashing down." She didn't know when, she didn't know how, but she knew her revenge would no longer just be whispers in the dark. She was waiting for the right moment, And that moment was closer than she thought. The night of the storm changed everything. The rain fell in heavy sheets, thunder shook the ground, and the mansion's power flickered. She had been ordered to stay awake and watch the kitchen in case water leaked through the roof. While moving buckets around, she heard shouting from upstairs. Mr. Roland and Madame Helen were in a heated argument. She crept closer, her bare feet silent on the cold tiles. Their voices grew clearer. "You are careless," Madame Helen screamed. "If anyone finds those files, we are finished." Mr. Roland roared back. "And whose fault is it if the servant starts snooping? We can't even trust the girl anymore. She stares too much." Her breath caught in her throat. They were talking about her. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. For the first time, she realized they feared her. Just a little. They sensed something in her that was no longer weak. Minutes later, Roland stormed out, slamming the door. Helen muttered to herself angrily. They made a call. The girl strained to listen. Helen's voice was low but sharp. "If she steps out of line, get rid of her. I don't care how." Fear swept through her body, but it was quickly swallowed by determination. They thought they could erase her like a stain, but they didn't know the scars had made her unstoppable. She returned to her small room, sat in the darkness and whispered to herself, "If they want war, I will give them a war they will never forget." The storm outside roared louder, and she realized that it was not just the sky that was breaking. Her time of silence was ending. The mansion's atmosphere grew tense after that stormy night. Guards moved more often, doors were locked more tightly, and Madame Helen's eyes followed her every step. But instead of shrinking back, she became even more observant. She memorized the guard rotations, the hidden safes in the walls, and even the codes Roland used when unlocking his office. Every detail was stored in her mind like pieces of a puzzle. One evening, while carrying laundry upstairs, she overheard Mr. Roland speaking to a man she hadn't seen before. The man's accent was foreign, his tone urgent. "The authorities are sniffing round. You must move the money out of the country fast," he warned. Roland nodded nervously, wiping sweat from his forehead. She paused, pretending to adjust the basket in her hands, but she was listening carefully. Money, authorities, danger. This was no longer just a family secret. This was a ticking bomb, and she was the only one who knew enough to light the fuse. That night, she could hardly sleep. She lay awake, staring at the darkness, feeling the weight of her destiny pressing down on her chest. She thought of all the times she had been beaten, starved, and humiliated. She thought of Grace, the servant thrown out without mercy. She thought of the countless nights she whispered promises of revenge to herself. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of power. She finally understood something. She was not waiting for destiny anymore. Destiny was waiting for her to take the first step. And when she did, the world would remember it forever. Her first bold move came on a quiet afternoon. Madame Helen had left for a social gathering. Mr. Roland was locked in his office, and the guards were distracted at the gate. She moved quickly, her heart racing, and slipped into the study. She knew it was dangerous, but the hunger for freedom pushed her. On the desk, she found piles of papers scattered carelessly. She flipped through them, her fingers trembling. Hidden among the receipts and contracts was a small notebook. The pages were filled with coded transactions, offshore accounts, and names of powerful people tied to Roland's empire. Her breath caught as she realized what she was holding, evidence that could destroy them all.
Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the hallway. She shoved the notebook back into the drawer and pretended to dust the shells. Mr. Roland walked in, his eyes sharp. For a moment, he studied her closely. She lowered her gaze, heart pounding, afraid he could hear it. But after a tense silence, he muttered, "Useless girl," and waved her away. She bowed quickly and slipped out, her legs trembling. Back in her room, she pressed her hands over her chest, gasping for breath. That close encounter had shaken her, but it also filled her with fire. For the first time, she had touched their deepest secrets. She whispered to herself, "One day, I will not just touch it, I will use it." From that moment, she stopped seeing herself as just a maid. She was no longer simply enduring, she was planning. And with every plan, the day of her revenge drew nearer. The mansion glittered with wealth, but inside its walls, cracks were widening. Mr. Roland grew restless, pacing the hallways at night, his phone glued to his ear. Madame Helen snapped at the servants more often than before, her temper sharper than before. And through it all, the maid remained silent, her eyes calm, her mind working like fire. One evening, she was ordered to serve drinks during a private dinner with 3 guests. Their suits were expensive, their accents foreign, and their smiles carried danger. As she poured wine, she listened to their hushed conversation. "The funds must be moved quickly," one of them said. Another added, "If the wrong person talks, the government will shut everything down." Her hands almost trembled, but she held steady, pouring as though she heard nothing. Yet every word carved itself into her memory. By the time she returned to the kitchen, she knew her enemies were building their own downfall faster than she had imagined. That night, she sat on the cold floor of her room and thought about her future. She realized that revenge alone was not enough. She didn't just want them to suffer. She wanted the world to see them fall. She wanted their power stripped away in public, their names dragged through the mud, their wealth crumbling like sand. She placed her scarred hands together and whispered, "One day, I will make the world watch as they kneel." It was no longer a dream. It was a promise. Her chance came in the most unexpected way. A government officer visited the mansion one morning, claiming to be inspecting Roland's business records. The servant whispered in fear, but she stood quietly, her eyes sharp. She watched as Roland forced a smile, guiding the officer around the house, showing only what he wanted to be seen. But she noticed the nervous twitch in his hands, the beads of sweat on his forehead. As the officer prepared to leave, she made a bold decision. Carrying a tray of tea past the study, she accidentally dropped a small slip of paper near the officer's briefcase. It was a copied note she had secretly written from Roland's notebook. A few suspicious numbers, a bank name, nothing more, but enough to raise doubts. The officer bent down, picked it up, and frowned. Roland's eyes darted to her, but she quickly bowed, pretending to be clumsy. That night, the house was on fire with tension. Roland shouted, Helen slammed doors, and the guards moved nervously. They suspected nothing of her, but she knew she had planted a seed that would soon grow into a storm. Lying in her room, she felt a strange calmness wash over her. For the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a warrior hiding in plain sight, holding a sword no one could see. She thought of all the scars, all the hunger, all the humiliation, and she smiled through the darkness.
Her revenge was no longer far away. It was already knocking at the door. The mansion that once broke her became the very place of their downfall. It began quietly. News reports whispering about fraud, government raids in the city, foreign accounts being frozen. Mr. Roland grew pale, his phone glued to his ear, while Madame Helen screamed at everyone, even the guards. The empire they built on greed was collapsing and the world was watching. One evening, officers stormed the mansion. Papers were seized, safes were emptied, and Roland was dragged out in handcuffs. Cameras flashed at the gate as reporters shouted questions. Helen's face twisted with rage as she was pushed into a waiting car. The servants watched in silence, but their eyes carried relief. For once, justice had stepped into the mansion. And there she stood, no longer hidden in the shadows, dressed not in rags but in a simple gown. Her scars visible, but her head held high, she watched them being taken away. People turned their eyes towards her, whispering in awe. The girl who was sold as a maid was now the one who had brought down a kingdom of corruption. Her heart was steady as she walked out of the gates, past the flashing cameras, past the stunned neighbors. She did not gloat. She did not shout. Her silence was louder than 1,000 voices. In her heart, she whispered the same words she had whispered all those years in the dark. One day, you will kneel. And indeed, the whole world had watched them kneel.